Hi, I hope you've listened to the reading from Luke chapter 8 before you're listening to this. That would be really, really helpful. In fact, this week, I think might be good to listen to the reading a second time after you've listened to this message. See how you feel when you get to the end of it. Also, there's a supplementary message if you want to follow up on a couple of points. Do get in touch with us if you'd like to join us on Sunday mornings by Zoom. We can send you the link. That would be a pleasure. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're safe, and I hope that you will stay safe and help others to be as well. Did you notice in the reading why Jesus taught in parables? Because you may have got the wrong end of the stick. Check me out on this. Jesus taught in parables to make it harder to understand. That's what he says. So that's what he was about. I know you may have thought that the point of a parable was an easy illustration from everyday life or a story so that you could see the point more clearly. But actually, that's not what he says he's doing. He says it's to make it harder. That's really good teaching, by the way. See, if you want people to understand something, don't just teach them a formula. Don't draw them a diagram. Tell them a story or give them an illustration. Play a game with them. Get them involved in working it out for themselves. The beauty of the way Jesus speaks in parables is he doesn't even tell you the rules of the parable. He just says, I'm going to give you an illustration to make it harder for you to understand. Play the game with me. And it's as you play the game with Jesus, as you go, well, why is he saying that? Well, what's the point in that detail? Where's this going anyway? How is this working? If it's meant to work this way, then it means one thing. If it's meant to work another way, it means something different. And it's that exploration of meaning that puts a responsibility on the hearer to interpret and understand that leads to true learning. Exploration leads to learning. Learning formulae and diagrams really doesn't do anything of the sort. I want to suggest a way we can go about this. How about we have a quick think about the world in which Jesus lived and his first hearers heard him? Because I think they can understand the parable in a way that we cannot. And then how about we look at its application to us in our world, because there's dynamics to this parable that we can understand better than they could 2,000 years ago in the place where Jesus lived. So let's step back to their situation first. Jesus is a carpenter. And I notice that once, possibly twice, we see illustrations that might have involved woodwork in some way. Apart from that, the main theme is grain harvest. As an illustration, he uses constantly. Why? Well, the answer is that, of course, as a carpenter, he had taken part in grain harvesting, in sowing seed, in working in the fields, because, well, pretty much everybody did. His friends who were fishermen by trade will also have known the feel of the soil beneath their feet and the sensation of the seed grain in the hand ready to sow it. These things were known by everybody. Let's think about the city folk for a moment. You might think, well, the city folk wouldn't have known anything about this. Okay, where's the biggest city that Jesus ever visited his whole life? Answer: the capital city of Israel, Jerusalem. It was huge. It was so big, it was almost twice the size of Bridgewater. So, in our terms, it wouldn't have been called a city, actually, really, would it? Well, it was densely packed, so it probably had about 80,000 people in it, about twice the population of Bridgewater. So it was, for the people who knew it, the big place. And those who lived there didn't really live there all the time and grow up there. They didn't live city lives. Maybe 1 or 2% of people might have lived like that, but most of them, they had family in the countryside growing grain. Most of them had grown up in the countryside growing grain. Gone to school? Never gone to school. Synagogue did some teaching. Most of them learned to read and write at the synagogue, but they didn't go to school. What did you do as a child? You went into the fields to work. Everybody worked grain fields virtually at some point in their lives or other, and about 95% of the population of Israel at the time worked in grain fields as the primary way of getting a living. So the methods are what feature in the parable a bit. We'll take a quick look at the methods because they're so different to methods we may be familiar with. But most importantly, we'll need to come to the significance of the seed grain held in the hand and thrown onto the surface of the soil. Let's take a quick look at the methods then. Well, everything was by the sweat of human labour. For most people, when you brought the harvest in, you carried it on your back to wherever it was going to be stored. Some people would use beasts of burden, but mostly it was carried by hand. It was stacked in the field by hand. It was cut by hand. We were well over 1,000 years before any farm machinery was conceived of, or the sound of an engine would be heard on any farm on planet Earth. There's nothing like that. Everything was done by hand. The ploughing, so the first thing in the process was the scattering of the seed grain onto the surface of the soil. Then you plough it in. The ploughing was done behind a strong animal, hopefully an ox, but if you couldn't afford an ox, maybe a couple of donkeys or something, but an animal would be needed for the strength. But still a person, a strong person, was needed to handle the plough by hand, walking the plough across the surface of the field, back and forth, keeping it at the right depth, stopping it going off course. Constant hard work. While the seed grain was growing in the field, people were out in the field almost daily weeding. There were no herbicides or sprays or anything like that. You pulled up the weeds by hand, and they knew these weeds. They knew these wild plants, so they knew all the names of them and so on. I wonder how many farmers in Somerset could name all the wild plants that grow in the area that they farm in. It's such a different thing. These people were so close to the soil. It was under their fingernails the whole time, whatever else they did in life. They knew the business of growing grain. And the significance for them was not just because the methods involved human sweat constantly, but because of the investment. When they went into the field and picked out of the seed grain bag, picked up a handful or a scoopful of seed grain to throw it away onto the surface of the soil before ploughing it in, they were holding their future. If this worked, they ate. If it worked well, they could afford to buy stuff. If it worked badly, they were hungry. If it worked really badly, they died, starved, or sold themselves into slavery, or something else like that, or hopeless debt. When they went out in the field to sow, it wasn't some romantic scene. This was the difference between life and death. So when Jesus spoke about it, he was speaking about a life-death situation to which they were all very close and very, very involved. So that's their life. Our life is very unlike that. The thing we know about, which they knew nothing about to speak of, is message. Okay, yes, they used message, and of course gospel, what Jesus was preaching and why he walked around doing it, was to share the message from God. But we know message in a whole different, epically different scale, and much closer and tighter than they did. Their culture was dominated by growing grain. You and I are dominated by message. For them, getting a message anywhere was really difficult. They didn't have media, they didn't have TV, radio, phone, they didn't have tablet, PC, laptop, postal services, anything like that. They couldn't buy a book. There was no printing of things. Nothing that you and I call media yet existed. And so it's you and I who know about volume of message and filtering out of message. We live under messaging, we participate in messaging. You get messaged more in a day than they received in a month or longer. You hear message, you read them, you store them, you delete them, you like them, or you disbelieve them. And unreal as message is, because like seed grain and soil, you can pick them up in your hands. You can't do that with a message. Message is actually more powerful. Message is what's shaping your life right now, and your response to message is what's determining whether you're wasting your breath and the days that you have on this life on earth, or whether you're using it well, whether you're being diverted to somebody else's agenda, or whether you're free to live the life that God has given you. Every day, fake news is after your loyalty. Exaggerated claims are after your money. And you are managing this somehow. Well done for managing it. How do you do it? Well, you do it by filtering out messages you don't think are important. You scarcely notice you've got them. You see messages, you hear messages, important, not important. Ignore or pay attention. Bother reading it, don't even bother opening it. You decide whether you're going to trust this message. It's from a trustworthy source, no, or oh, that's just them again, or whatever. It's just not to be trusted, can't be relied upon, or whatever. Discard it, don't pay it attention. Have I got time now? Don't really have time for it now. Hang on to it for a couple of days. Yeah, maybe hang on to it for a couple of days. Maybe I'll come back to it, maybe not. And we're just handling all this message all the time. We're allowing it to shape who we are, how we behave, and we are filtering it to try and get to what matters. And it's so easy to miss the message of God and to not hear what God is saying to us. God's message is the gospel of Jesus, a message of generous love, God's love for you and God's love for the world. This is a message which, if it lands on an unresponsive heart, is not going to go very far. If you're not interested in the business of love, you don't want to be loved by God, or you don't want to learn to share love in the world, you don't want to be drawn into an agenda of generous love, then your heart is hardened like the pathway through a field. The message lands on it, the birds of the air have got it and gone. Or the message of God and his generous love calls for commitment. And you may love the sound of the message because it promises you so much. It's so attractive to believe you're loved, and at the heart of the universe is the purpose of love. These things are attractive, but you want to hold it lightly. You don't want to get religion or anything. You just want to hold on to it lightly. And of course, as soon as the heat is on, what we hold lightly just withers away. It just can't remain there because we have no commitment to it. The message of God, what God has to say to us, deserves to be trusted as priority. What could be more important than what God has to say? But we may be swamped by so many other messages about the cares of life, about the messages that we do actually need to pay attention to some of them, and loads of them we don't need to pay any attention to at all. But there's so many of them that they can choke out the simplicity and the straightforwardness of what God has to say. But when there's a heart that's interested in love, or hearts are open to the message of love, when there's a readiness to make commitment, when there's faith enough to trust that what God has to say is actually what's really important and needs to have priority, then the result of the message of God is epic in scale. And the explosion of loving action and of transformed life for people, and indeed the creation itself, is more than 100-fold feedback, so to speak. Well, thousands of people heard Jesus preach, but just a few hundred heard what he said. Well, which are you? Which are you? See, the government of the time and the religious leaders were right. They looked around and said, look, there's not that many people following him. It's a message we don't want. Crucify him. The message will die on the cross with him. How wrong you can be. Jesus said, but if you can hear me, hear. God bless you.